Broken Bonds. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 2 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 29. After Anemone spent the afternoon checking over the sea witch and making sure she was fueled up and seaworthy, sunset couldn't come soon enough. Of course, it was probably wise to grab a bite to eat while she was waiting, seeing as Dunstan didn't need to eat. The gargoyle had impeccable timing, appearing in the kitchen just as she closed the dishwasher on her dinner dishes. "You ready for some sailing?" she greeted him. He grinned. "Either that or more dancing." She dreamed about him dancing last night. Only in her dreams, it wasn't just the shirt that had come off. She'd woken up so hot and bothered that she'd been forced to take care of herself again before she could go back to sleep. If Dunstan knew how badly she lusted after him. Anemone shook her head. "Sailing? Definitely. I've spent all afternoon getting the boat ready. This will be my first sail in far too long. We're doing this." He inclined his head. "Then we can dance together another night." "Oh yes, please." She managed not to say the words aloud, turning away to fill a cooler with drinks so he wouldn't read them on her face. "Right, shall we?" In no time at all, they were motoring past the yacht club pens and out of the harbor. "This sure beats waiting for the tide," Dunstan said, peering over her shoulder. That it did. "That tells you the depth, and those are the most recent charts," she said, pointing. "What powers the engine? Is it steam? Where is the funnel?" Dunstan asked. "Octane, with about 10% ethanol, which is the standard fuel mix at the yacht club. What with ethanol being a solvent and all, I try to get fuel without ethanol, but Morgan was the one who usually organized that, and I'm a little out of touch on where to get premium fuel at the moment." The look of bewilderment on his face reminded her that he was a carpenter, not a chemist. "Are you familiar with hydrocarbons?" He shook his head. "Coal, kerosene, oil? Octane is a fuel oil, sort of, only highly refined. My car runs on it too." He traveled with her in the car to and from Bunnings, but never asked about how that worked. Maybe he'd encountered cars before, likely whenever he'd learned to dance the Macarena. Only he didn't remember. The fuel is burned inside the engine cylinder, instead of using it to heat steam. But it still drives the engine. I know the chemistry involved, but if you wanted the technical specifications, I could find some schematics online when we get home. He just kept shaking his head. "Remarkable. We can turn off the motor and hoist the sails when we're clear of the port, and out of the main shipping lanes. Container ships stop for no one. Well, when you're that big, I imagine it'd be hard to slow down, let alone stop." "Container ships?" Anemone gestured toward the freighters anchored offshore, waiting for their turn to come into port and unload. In the waning light, they would soon be little more than hulking shadows on the horizon. "The cargo ships. We still import a lot of things from overseas, even if we export a bunch of stuff too. Mining resources mostly from the northern ports, and agricultural products from here and the southern ones. The borders might be closed to keep this stupid virus out, but cargo still comes through. But no more sails, except for, this is a pleasure craft, is it not?" A craft she and Morgan had taken a great deal of pleasure in sailing. She'd miss this. "Yes. Commercial boats all have engines of one kind or another." More head shaking. He looked sad. "The world has definitely changed." They'd reached open water, far enough away from gauge roads. Anemone switched the engine off. "Not everything. There's still wind and water and waves, and if you know how to hoist a sail." Dunstan definitely did know how to sail. Even with her as captain and him as first mate, they worked together seamlessly, like they'd sailed together forever. Morgan had preferred to be captain most of the time, and Anemone had never argued, but now, at the helm of her own boat, the freedom felt exhilarating. No wonder Morgan had wanted it so much. The breeze caught the sails, sending the sea witch flying across the waves. 30. Anemone tied the boat to a garishly yellow buoy beside a pile of submerged rocks, then brought out the bag she'd carried aboard at the beginning of the evening. "Can I interest you in a drink? We finished the whiskey last night, but I brought a couple of bottles of water and some beer, if you want one." Dunstan shook his head. The whiskey last night had burned its way down his throat just the way he remembered, but it hadn't brought with it the kind of intoxication a man wanted alcohol for. And what with the way Anemone had handled the boat, sailing as skillfully as any experienced sailor Dunstan had known, he was already well on his way to being intoxicated by her presence alone. If his stone heart had been capable of love, he'd be in terrible danger with Anemone. "Is there some significance to this spot?" he asked. She waved at the rock. "These rocks are a good fishing spot, hence the mooring, because it's a popular one, but it's also just far enough offshore to see the stars clearly." "See?" Indeed he did. "It's also the halfway point on some of the yacht club social races, because it's the perfect place to turn around. One turn around the rock, then headed for home. Sometimes we'd volunteer as race officials and head out here early in the day, and just float around until the race was over. Morgan used to set up a couple of lines to see if he could catch anything, but he rarely did. There's a pod of dolphins that swims around here, and the occasional sea lion. Not that it took more than one sea lion to make sure you couldn't land a fish. Those things are fast. So this was a special place for you and your husband. Yet she'd brought him here instead of coming alone." "Yes. No." Anemone sighed. "I liked it because it was peaceful. Just us and the waves and the sea life, you know? But Morgan didn't like being an official. He wanted to race, to pit himself against the others but also against himself. And this will sound crazy, but sometimes I think he saw the ocean as his nemesis. Like they were locked in a lifelong battle, him and the water. I guess I should have expected that one day the ocean would win, because one man is no match for the whole ocean, but it was such a big part of who Morgan was. More like a lifelong rivalry, I guess, not a battle, because the ocean never seemed to notice him. Until the day it took him for its own." A faint roar caught his ears, growing louder until Anemone evidently heard it too. "More night fishermen, I guess. Like I said, it's a good fishing spot," she said, pointing across the waves as she raised what appeared to be a pair of spyglasses bound together. "Yep, recreational fishermen for sure. Ones with more money than sense, judging by how fast they're going. Professionals would never waste fuel like that, unless someone else was paying." She offered the spyglasses to Dunstan. He peered through them, soon finding the noisy craft. It was larger than the boats in the yacht club pens, but it appeared to be hollow underneath. "It looks like one of those Pacific Island fishing boats with two hulls, only writ large and polished up like it's supposed to be a royal pleasure barge or something." Anemone laughed. "Morgan talked about trading in the Sea Witch and getting a catamaran, though a smaller one than that, I'm sure. They're faster and have more space on deck. When the settlement came through on selling our old house, I figured it was only a matter of time before he came home with the details of exactly which cat he intended to buy, but by the time the buyers settled, he was already gone." She reached up. "Better get the lights on, so they can see us and the warning buoy. Wouldn't want that thing running aground on a rock. The repair bill would be more than our boat's worth." A string of small lights ignited, outlining the yacht in a warm glow of 1,000 candles with not a flicker among them. Anemone caught him staring. "They run on electricity and they're all LEDs, so the whole thing's powered by a couple of batteries. If you want to know how it all works, when we get home, I can." Dunstan held up his hand. "No. I'm not sure I would understand anyway. I am a carpenter, not a scholar. It is enough that the lights illuminate. Let their working remain a mystery. I am content. He was too. He stretched out on the deck. He could lie here all night just looking up at the stars. Or he could, until Anemone let out a string of foul language that would blister the ears of even the coarsest sailor. She turned on a light much brighter than the others, which she began to wave in the direction of the approaching vessel, which wasn't slowing down. Now Dunstan understood her issue. The fools aboard the catamaran evidently hadn't seen them, and they were headed straight for them. The roar of the engine became so loud, he couldn't even hear Anemone's shouting. And still they kept coming. He had only one thought: he had to save her. 31. Wankers! Anemone screamed at the catamaran as they swerved, sending a wave of water to swamp the poor sea witch. Maniacal laughter rang out from the boat as they sped away, raising their drink cans to her in mock salute. Only then did she realize that she was no longer standing on the deck of the Sea Witch, but several meters up in the air, with Dunstan's softly beating wings on either side of her, holding them both aloft. She stared at him in wonder. "You saved me." Again. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. For a man made of stone, his lips were surprisingly warm, and his tongue was everything she wanted it to be. If she wasn't mistaken, that devilish tongue of his was doing the Macarena in her mouth. Reluctantly, she pulled away. "You can probably put me down now." The Sea Witch was awash, but it wasn't so low in the water that a bit of bailing wouldn't sort the problem. "I will go after them and see that they pay for what they did. This is an act of war, and I will not allow them to get away with it," Dunstan declared. Anemone sighed. "No, it's just a bunch of drunken wankers playing with their expensive toys. With no other witnesses, there's nothing anyone can do about it. It's better if you help me bail the water out, so we can sail home. So much for a relaxing evening sail." "But this is unacceptable. You could have been killed." "Between our life jackets and the EPIRB, the volunteer sea rescue guys would have found us, no worries. Not to mention the life raft that would have inflated. Still would if she didn't get the water out of the boat now. Help me please." Grumbling, Dunstan grabbed a bucket. They were soon headed back to shore, too busy sailing the boat to discuss that kiss. Which was probably for the best, Anemone decided. 32. Anemone. She'd barely stepped out of her car before she was enveloped in a hug so tight it'd make a python proud. "Emily?" Anemone mumbled through a mouthful of the woman's coat. "Of course, silly. I thought you wouldn't come. After the news yesterday." Emily pulled away and ducked her head. Whatever the news was, it couldn't be good. "What news?" Emily's eyes widened. "You mean you haven't heard?" It was at the entrance to Fishing Boat Harbor, right outside. Some politician's boat sank. The rescue divers were all over it yesterday, and they said it looked like the boat had run aground on some rocks, and it was taking on water when it limped back into the harbor, but it was so badly damaged it sank before it reached shore. One of those big luxury boats too, like the Rottnest ferry only smaller. Here, they took pictures when they refloated it. They had to, or no one could get in or out of the harbor, and the fishing fleet was up in arms, ready to move it themselves if someone else didn't. She pulled out her phone, tapped at it a few times, then held it out. "The guy who owns it is being investigated for corruption now. Apparently even a politician's salary isn't enough to cover the costs of a boat that size. It's been impounded in the dry dock." Even when it was being hauled out sideways, Anemone couldn't mistake the wanker's boat from Saturday night. She zoomed in on the hull she could see. It looked like someone had thrown rocks at it, or more likely thrown a few punches with stone fists. She'd have to ask Dunstan about it when she got home. Was anyone hurt? Anemone asked. Not that I heard. A bit wet maybe, or a few scrapes climbing up the rocks to the road. Why? Did you know them? Anemone shook her head. No, she didn't know them, and she didn't want to. And if all they'd lost was their boat and a bit of skin, they should consider themselves lucky. Emily looked relieved. Well, that's good then. I thought you'd heard about it, and after what happened to your husband, you wouldn't want to come out with us today. She had been shaken on Saturday night and for most of yesterday, vowing not to go out in the Sea Witch again until it was completely dry from its soaking, but the Maritime Museum's research boat was much bigger, and it would be moored at a protected dive site. There wouldn't be any yahoos speeding through that patch of reef. If they did, they'd end up as another wreck among the historic ones already nestled between the reefs. Besides, she'd be going out in daytime on a clear day. Drunken Saturday night revelers wouldn't be out menacing the public in the middle of a work day. And now she knew the boat that had endangered her was stuck in dry dock indefinitely. Today's trip was looking a whole lot safer. I'll have to get back onto a boat sometime. It may as well be now, Anemone said, slinging her bag aboard before climbing over the gunwales herself. Do I need to get my air tanks out of the car, or will you have enough for me? Jeremy has enough for a small army. Don't worry about bringing your own. We'll have you covered. Emily landed on the deck beside Anemone's bag. I'll stow this for you. Anemone stepped into the main cabin, where she found Jeremy. Emily says you're bringing an army. The brief I got didn't say anything about invading Rottnest. Jeremy looked puzzled for a moment, then his expression cleared. Oh, you mean the dive tanks? No, I just wanted to make sure we had enough. We ran out at the Abrolhos, and getting more air out there was a nightmare. Especially when there's only so much good weather for diving out there. She'd been scheduled to go with them on that trip. Then Morgan had died and she'd transferred. How did it go? Did you uncover many more secrets? The great cameo, maybe? Jeremy shook his head. Just the bodies we knew were under the fishing shacks. They're all gone now. Nothing but ghosts remain. Anemone nodded. She'd heard the stories. Most people who visited Beacon Island preferred to sleep aboard their boats, rather than stay on the island itself after dark. It wasn't called the Island of Angry Ghosts for nothing. And anything else you found is waiting on the conservation team to see what you have before you report on it. We could do with your expertise. We'd take you back in a heartbeat, you know, even if your secondment isn't over. I'm sure we could find someone else to fill the spot at the prison. Anemone closed her eyes. She fitted in among the museum team as easily as if she'd never left, but it wasn't the people who had driven her away. No, it was the talk of shipwrecks and deaths at sea that drove her to tears, and in the Maritime Archaeology Division of the museum, everything was about shipwrecks. Let's see how I go today first, she said firmly. 33. Anemone double-checked her gear, then checked it again, before she ventured off the boat into the water. Everyone else had already submerged, so she was the last to reach the dive trail. She'd forgotten how peaceful it was beneath the surface. Nothing but bubbles and fish, with the distant boom of waves breaking on the outer reef. Oh, she'd missed this. She kicked slowly along the dive trail, pausing to check the plaques. They were in surprisingly good condition, given how eager the coral was to colonize anything that stayed beneath the surface for any length of time. No need for a corrosion expert here. The wreck was another matter. If she hadn't known it was there, hidden beneath the encroaching coral, she could have swum straight past. But there were still straight edges to be seen among the sea life, even after more than 100 years. The sort of lines nature didn't produce without human intervention. She paused for a long look, letting the camera mounted on her mask get plenty of footage before she moved on. Today was just a preliminary assessment, to look around and see what they needed to focus their attention on during later dives. So the morning was set aside for the dive trail, and the afternoon was for the likely mooring sites. The dive team had stopped to watch a seal, but Anemone had too much experience with seals trying to steal her gear to want to join them. Instead, she headed back to the boat. The others surfaced soon after, and they ate lunch while discussing what they'd seen. One of the guys had spotted a turtle, and they all crowded around the laptop screen to see the footage he'd recorded. The afternoon westerly was in by the time they were scheduled to do the second dive, and Anemone decided to stay in the cabin and watch the live feed instead of joining the divers. It looked like clean sandy bottom, the perfect place to put in moorings. The team spread out to identify any potential hazards, and Anemone turned to get changed out of her wetsuit. "Shit, what's that?" Jeremy said. "It looks brand new," Emily breathed. "Hey Anemone, come take a look. How long do you think it could have been down there?" Anemone answered before she'd even seen the screen. "If there's no coral accretion, less than a year most likely." She peered at the picture, as the diver circled around the gap in the reef where the fishing boat lay on the section of sandy bottom. Then he dropped lower and a rock lobster scuttled out of his way. The registration number came into view. Anemone blinked. That couldn't be right. The perfect catch hadn't been anywhere near Rottnest. They'd been on the way back from Karnak Island when... "I need to go down there," she said, zipping up her wetsuit. Emily and Jeremy were too intent on the screen to hear her. "There's her name, the perfect catch. It looks like it only sank yesterday. Hey Anemone, how long do you think?" 11 months, 23 days and about 14 hours, Anemone said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Emily laughed. "Wow, that's precise. How can you?" "That's the boat my husband skippered on the night he died." Silence reigned in the cabin. "I need to go down there. Can you double-check my gear for me please, Jeremy?" Wordlessly, Jeremy did as she asked, then gave the signal for OK with both hands. Anemone barely felt the water's chill as it closed over her head. It took her a moment to orient herself, before she saw the fins of the diver who'd been filming the catch. The current tried to tug her away, but Anemone only kicked harder. She had to see it for herself. To know what had happened. The ship sat on the bottom, tipped over on an angle like it had been beached on shore. The windows were intact, without even the usual salt crusting. Washed away by the water, Anemone assumed. She switched on her dive torch and shone it through the nearest window. The cabin looked exactly as she remembered it, with the exception of the metal chests stacked up along one wall. One had fallen over on its side, but the impact hadn't been enough to jolt it open. She moved around to the next window and the next. Was that a hint of red? She swam around to the cabin door and shone her torch through that. Oh, it was red all right. A big coral trout, printed on the back of the fishing shirt she'd bought Morgan for their last Christmas together. She reached for the door handle. It moved easily, but tugging the door open was another matter. In the end, it took two of them to open it halfway, wide enough for Anemone to squeeze inside. She grabbed the shirt to pull it out from under the console. A small crab scuttled out of the collar across. White bone, oh God. 34. We have to call the police. Should we take her to hospital? She hasn't said anything since she surfaced. She took all her gear off and put it away perfectly. Maybe she just doesn't want to talk. Would you want to, after finding that? I mean, it looked like one of the Batavia bodies. One of the victims. Yeah, but you should talk. Especially after finding something like that. Anemone? Are you all right? Fine, she heard herself say. I just need to get home. Maybe I'm not ready to go out on a boat again yet. Mike's pulling everyone out early. The police divers will want to dive the site before we can go any further. We'll head back as soon as everyone's aboard. Or we can put you ashore and you can catch a ferry back. Anemone must have said something, because the next thing she remembered, she was trudging up the stairs to her apartment. Her hand shook, but she managed to get the keys into the lock eventually. Her bed was waiting with open arms to embrace her, so she flopped down face first and welcomed oblivion. 35. She'd gone to bed in daylight, with the blinds wide open, so Dunstan had to wait in the walls until after sunset before he could go to her. At first she'd just laid there, not moving or saying anything. Then she'd started weeping, and she showed no sign of stopping. His heart ached for her. The moment the sun slipped below the horizon, he crossed the room in swift strides and slipped in behind her on the bed, drawing her to him. She was sobbing in earnest now, her whole body shaking. It's all right. It's all right, he soothed, even though he knew it was a lie. Nothing that could break a woman's heart so thoroughly could ever be in any way right. I found him. I found him, Dunstan. Morgan's dead. He really did drown. He went down with his ship and I found him. Between sobs the story spilled out. She'd found her husband's body and the ship he'd been sailing on when he died. She now knew for certain that he was never, ever coming back. Through it all, every heart-wrenching detail, he held her until she lay still and he thought she slept. Perhaps she did for a short time. Darkness had definitely fallen when she spoke again. I feel so alone, Dunstan. You're not alone. You're here with me. I'll keep you safe, I promise. What if I want to feel more than just safe? He blew out a breath. Whatever you wish for, name it. If I can give it to you, it is yours. I want to feel loved. Like I'm not alone. I want to feel. He tightened his arms around her. I know you can feel this. I'm here, Anemone. I won't leave you. I want more than your arms around me. I want to feel you inside me. It shouldn't have been possible, but his cock stood to attention, like she'd called it by name. The damn thing didn't even have a name. He couldn't, this was... Dunstan, I want you to fuck me. 36. Before she could change her mind, Anemone wriggled out of her clothes and threw them on the floor. Then she pressed back against Dunstan and triumph welled in her breast. She couldn't be imagining it. That had to be his hard length, digging into her hip. He wanted this too, as much as she did. She rubbed against him. Fuck me, Dunstan. Hard. So I forget everything I saw today, and all I can think about is you. He wrapped his arms around her again, more tentative now he was touching bare skin. Then he slid a hand down her belly, so slowly it was torturous. Finally, he slid one finger inside her. More, she demanded, reaching down to make him give it to her. Something twined around her wrist, holding her fast before binding her other wrist too, laying them on the bed beside her. Was that his tail? 2 fingers now, rubbing against her clit on every thrust inside her. God, this was better than she'd imagined it could be. 3 fingers, one of them hooked at just the right angle to, oh God. Then his thumb landed on her clit, circling it just right as his fingers pushed deeper, harder, and she couldn't. She let out a shriek. Are you satisfied? He asked, his voice rough in her ear. And that was his, so hard against her hip, even bigger and harder than before. She should have said yes. One glorious orgasm was more than she deserved. She was a widow. She was supposed to be in mourning, damn it. But she wanted. I want more, she said. I want you to fuck me. Properly. Not just with your fingers. Please, Dunstan, I need to feel you inside me. Anemone. Don't you dare apologize or tell me you can't. I can feel how hard your cock is, and I want you to fuck me with it. Now. She tried to reach behind her to grab him, but his tail still held her hands fast, so she pressed against him instead, the softness of her body against the hardness of his. Please? His hand moved to her hip, gripping it lightly. The heat of him between her thighs, ready to enter her, but not quite. Please, Dunstan, she begged. With one powerful thrust, he impaled her, and she cried out in triumph. She felt that all right. Couldn't think of anything else but the hard, molten heat of him moving inside her, deeper than she'd imagined possible, filling her. His hand drifted back to her clit, stroking her to the same beat of his thrusts. Slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the universe. Her universe, for there was nothing else but her and him, and the sensation of what he was doing to her. She was so lost in the pleasure of his touch, both inside and out, that she barely felt the orgasm building until the feeling was so huge, she was powerless to stop it. It swept her away on a wave of bliss, and all she could do was cry out his name over and over, because there was space for no one else but Dunstan in her thoughts, while he possessed her body so completely. 37. Sunlight streamed through Anemone's window when she opened her eyes the next morning. For a moment she wondered if she'd dreamed at all, but she knew she couldn't have. Between her nakedness, the stone hand cupping her breast and the other stone hand curved around her hip, there was no denying it. Morgan was dead, and she'd just had the best sex of her life with a gargoyle. She tried to push his hands off her so she could get up, but they wouldn't move. Instead, she had to wiggle out of his grasp, only to discover that she'd been sharing the bed with an actual statue. It took her a moment to remember what he'd said about sunlight, how it turned him to stone, like the gargoyle on the roof. Had she Medusa'd him by asking him to go to bed with her? She'd never forgive herself if she had. She thought for a moment, then grabbed the quilt and flung it over him. Next, she closed the blinds so sunlight wasn't spilling across the bed anymore. Somewhere in the house, a phone was ringing. Anemone swore, grabbing a robe to throw around her shoulders as she sprinted toward the sound. Of course, the call went to voicemail before she found her phone. And it was an unknown number, so she couldn't call them back. She held the phone in front of her, staring at it, willing them to call back. Someone began pounding on her front door instead. She pulled her robe on properly, tied it tightly around her waist, and went to the door. "Who is it?" she called. Only Katina had the keys to the front door, so it had to be. "It's the police, Dr. Seaver. Your neighbor was just leaving for work, so she let us in." Well, that sucked. No way was she answering the door in just her robe if they were here. "Give me a minute to get dressed and I'll be right back," she said. The bed was empty when she reached the bedroom, though the quilt lay in a heap beside the wall instead of on the bed where she'd left it. Dunstan must be all right, despite his sunlight exposure then. She dressed quickly in the first things she found, then headed back to the front door to let the police in. "Can we come in?" one of them asked. She wanted to say no, but she didn't want to talk to them outside on the landing either. Anemone sighed. "All right." She led the way to the kitchen. While they said whatever they wanted to say, she could at least make some coffee. Maybe even breakfast. A chirp drew her attention to the corner, where Lucky sat expectantly beside her empty bowl. Right. The cat needed breakfast too. The two officers took seats on the bar stools and then just sat there silently watching, while Anemone fed the cat and made coffee. Finally, just to break the silence, she said, "Do you want one?" and pointed at her coffee. They both shook their heads. She was quickly losing patience with these two. "Are you here to tell me my husband is dead?" Because I already know. First, everyone else got rescued but him. Then, the coroner declared him dead. And yesterday, while I was at work, we found the boat with his body still in it. His skeleton, wearing his shirt, seeing as there wasn't much left of him after almost a year in the water. Tears filled her eyes, threatening to fall, but she dashed them away. She would not cry in front of these two strangers. The two men exchanged a look. Finally one of them said, "I'm Detective Rasool, and this is Detective Nunzio. We're sorry for your loss and sorry to have to bother you at such a difficult time, but we want to know if you recognize this." He pulled out a tablet, scrolled to something, then held up the screen so she could see it. It was a wall with red letters scrawled across it in what looked like lipstick. "Tell us where he is if you don't want to meet the same fate." Anemone blinked. "I don't understand." Rasool took the tablet back. "Nor does the nurse who bought your old house. She came home from night shift at the hospital and found this. That's why she didn't recognize it. It was the lounge room wall, which had been covered in bookcases when Anemone and Morgan lived there." "I still don't understand." "Somehow the boat you found was leaked to the media. Luckily, we've managed to keep the news about your husband's body and the other items in the boat under wraps for now, but it looks like someone saw the news and came to find you. Or him if they think he's still alive. That poor nurse. At least she hadn't been home when they'd come to her house. If they'd come here, Dunstan would have beaten them to a pulp in the name of protecting her. Well, probably if they hadn't come when they were busy." Her mind went back to what the detective had said. What other items? She hadn't seen another body, but seeing Morgan's was bad enough. It's not like she'd looked for anyone else. "What do you know about illegal drugs, Dr. Seaver?" She blew out a breath. That they're illegal? Look, I know I have a background in chemistry, which means everyone thinks I'm just one bad decision away from breaking bad, but my PhD was in marine corrosion, and my job is conservation of artifacts for a museum where I'm one of the assistant curators. The only thing I know about illegal drugs is that they're bad. Did you know that your husband was involved in the illegal drug trade? Anemone burst out laughing. "Morgan? You can't be serious. He wouldn't even take paracetamol for a headache, he was so anti-drugs. I mean, his mum died of an accidental drug overdose. And no, they weren't illegal drugs. She and Morgan's dad were in a car accident, and she had some prescription pain medication, which she accidentally overdosed on. Morgan's dad found her and, well, I imagine you know he felt responsible for the accident and her death, and he didn't want to live without her, and there was still enough of her pain medication left." Anemone swallowed. Morgan was devastated. That's why he wouldn't take anything, just in case. So there is absolutely no way he would have anything to do with drugs, legal or illegal. Another exchanged glance. "Then can you explain this?" Another swipe of the tablet, and a new picture on the screen. This time it showed a bunch of metal boxes, sitting open on a table. "Those boxes were in the boat cabin with Morgan's body," Anemone said slowly. "But there's no way he would have agreed to transport drugs. He was covering for Janus Smith, the owner of the Perfect Catch, who was sick and couldn't take the charter, so he asked Morgan to do it for him. If Morgan had known there were drugs in those boxes, he never would have boarded that boat. It's methamphetamine. The street value of a haul this big is more than 10 times what the boat was worth, or at least what the insurance payout was." Anemone shrugged. "I wouldn't know anything about that. It wasn't Morgan's boat or mine. If it was insured, that was Janus's business, not ours." "Dr. Seaver, did your husband have enemies?" "No. He was a lovely, kind man, willing to do anyone a favor, up to and including sailing Janus's rust bucket of a charter boat for him, when the man was too stingy to hire staff to cover for him. I can't think of anyone who didn't like Morgan. He was wonderful. Now she was tearing up again, and she couldn't stop it this time. Crying into her coffee, no less. Dr. Seaver, did you get a close look at the body? Anemone closed her eyes. She had video footage of the dive, but she didn't need to download a single second of it, when the whole thing played on repeat in the back of her mind. It was face down, wearing the shirt I bought him, on the floor under the console. When I tried to pull it out, his head sort of fell to pieces. Just like the Batavia bodies. Bludgeoned to death by their own shipmates. The detectives were nodding, like this was a good thing. A skull fracture, likely the cause of death, though it's impossible to be certain after this long in the water. Someone hit him. Someone hit him on the back of the head when he found out about the drugs and objected, or threatened to call the police. Because Morgan would never stay quiet. And if the drug dealers believed he was still alive and knew where their missing drugs were, no wonder they were looking for him. But at their old address, which they'd left a year ago, to move here. It was only a matter of time before they discovered their mistake, and came after her. Or worse, hurt that poor nurse who had nothing to do with any of this. Dr. Seaver. She gripped the bench in an effort to stop herself from swaying. This was too much, first thing in the morning, before she'd even finished her first cup of coffee. Especially after everything that had happened yesterday. Dr. Seaver, here's my card. If you think of anything important about your husband or the boat, or what you saw in the boat yesterday, please give us a call. And please don't leave town just in case we have more questions. They rose to go. Hysterical laughter bubbled up. Where would I go? All the borders are shut to contain this stupid virus. Even if I wanted to, my life, my home, even my husband's body, everything is here. If you find out anything about the people who killed my husband, you'll find me here. We're very sorry for your loss, Dr. Seaver. We'll see ourselves out. Actually, she saw them out, and once she'd shut the door firmly behind them, she bolted it too. Couldn't be too careful with killer drug dealers about. 38. A message from Emily told her they wouldn't be diving until the police were done raising the boat, so she wouldn't be needed today. Anemone considered calling in sick to work, but she couldn't stand sitting around at home with her thoughts in such a tangled mess, so she changed into some work clothes and went into the prison. Beth was delighted to see her, and immediately set her to cataloging the artifacts the archaeologists had brought in on Friday. It was mind-numbingly repetitive enough not to require too much thought, while at the same time requiring sufficient focus to keep her mind from wandering to other things she'd rather avoid thinking about. Boats and bodies for a start. The sun was slipping down behind approaching storm clouds as Anemone walked home, giving her just enough time to heat something up for dinner before Dunstan appeared, looking as alive as ever, and as if he hadn't turned into a statue in her bed that morning. He looked like the hot man who had made love to her last night. If she closed her eyes, she could still feel him. But she couldn't think about that now. She needed to tell him about Morgan's murder, and the other things the police had shared. In between bites of green curry and rice, made in the slow cooker on Sunday, she told him everything. By the time she was done, there was nothing but a few grains of rice stuck to the side of her bowl, and the bottle of wine she'd opened to have with it was half gone. The only thing I know for sure is that Morgan never would have had anything to do with drug smuggling. So if someone killed him, it was because of that. Unlike the police, Dunstan just nodded. At least he believed her. It sounds to me that the people with answers were the smugglers who were on the boat with him. The ones who were rescued. And perhaps the owner of the boat, for he was the one who was hired to transport the drugs in the first place, Dunstan said. Anemone spread her arms wide. But what can I do about that? The police are probably already talking to them, or they will soon, and whoever wrote that threat on the wall meant it for me. I'm hardly going to go to them and make it easy for them. I mean, if they killed Morgan, there's nothing to stop them from doing the same to me, especially if they want the drugs, which the police already have. You don't have to do anything. Now, first things first, you're assuming it's murder, but what if they didn't mean to kill him? Especially if they think he's still alive. Maybe they got into a fight, and one of them got in a good punch that knocked him down and he hit his head when he fell. He might have even stood up and seemed fine. I've seen it before, men brawling and then walking back to their lodgings, only to be found dead in their beds in the morning. Maybe his death was an accident. Anemone swallowed. Manslaughter, not murder, but that doesn't make it right. Morgan shouldn't have died. Dunstan inclined his head. Agreed. Perhaps his shipmates brought the contraband aboard without telling him what he was carrying. Maybe no one knew but the man whose boxes they were, and your husband stumbled across them. He flipped his hand over. Or perhaps they all knew. His shipmates, the owner, everyone except your husband. Anemone nodded slowly. Which means the best person to ask is the owner of the boat. Anemone started to laugh. You don't know Janus. He's as slippery as a bucket of eels, and greedy to boot. He begged to have his boat included in my PhD project, just so he could get a free anti-corrosion paint job on his rust bucket, and then when I saw it and chose his boat as my control, the one without any coating, seeing as it was so long overdue a new coating that it might as well not have any, he pitched an absolute fit. He's hated me ever since. Funny, seeing as I got along with his wife, Lucy, really well, but I haven't seen her since they got divorced. How much would it cost to charter his boat for a night, like those smugglers did? Anemone shrugged. She'd never needed a charter, what with the sea witch and all. Even if she had, everyone at the yacht club had owed Morgan a favor for something, so she'd only have had to ask. You probably won't need to charter the whole boat. Janus runs night fishing charters, which are only a couple $100 per person. If you joined one of those, you wouldn't have to charter the whole boat. Dunstan looked horrified. $200 for a night's sail? Ah. Inflation had changed prices a lot since Dunstan was a boy. I'm sure I owe you that much and more for fixing my ceiling. I'll get some cash out in the morning and find out when the next charter's running. Just please be careful, okay? Dunstan grinned. You needn't worry about me. If he tries to punch me, it's his hand that will break, not my head, I promise you. And if I throw a few punches of my own? He looked positively gleeful at the prospect. Anemone only felt sick. Please don't. There's been enough violence. I don't want anyone else hurt. I just want to know that whoever killed Morgan goes to prison, hopefully for a long time, and that they won't come after me or anyone else. He bowed his head. Don't you worry. I'm your sworn protector, and I will do whatever is necessary to keep you safe. And that worried her more than ever. 39. Dunstan had barely been aboard the catch of the day for 5 minutes, and he already knew the captain, Janus Smith, was more in love with money than anything else in the world, even his boat. The other men aboard didn't seem to notice the dents and rust stains marking the gunnels, or perhaps it was so dark they couldn't see them. But they handed over their money readily enough. When they held out a plastic card to the beeping machine in Janus's hands, he frowned, but when they produced cash, his grin got just a little bit wider. Dunstan was loath to hand so much money to the man, but this was necessary to avenge Anemone's husband, and keep her safe, he told himself as he forced himself to part with the fortune Anemone had given him. Janus just accepted it with a nod and pocketed the notes, as if he did this every day. Perhaps he did, and the battered boat belied how wealthy the man was. But if he'd made that wealth at the cost of Anemone's husband's life. Dunstan clenched his fists. If his suspicions proved true, he'd destroy this boat just as he'd done to the Wankers vessel. He made a mental note to ask Anemone what Wankers were. Sit down, grab a beer, and make yourself comfortable. We'll be heading out to one of my favorite secret fishing spots, before we drop a few lines and see what we catch. Then we'll move on to another spot, and maybe even a third before the night is out. We'll do some high-speed trolling traveling between spots, and see if we can hook a wahoo or two along the way too. Janus flipped open a blue chest, filled with ice and cans, and began tossing cans to the half a dozen men assembled on his deck. The others opened their drinks, but Dunstan didn't bother. It wasn't like he'd be drinking it, anyway. Instead, he pretended to swig from the closed can, laughing at the other men's jokes, even if he didn't understand half of them. Finally they dropped anchor, and Janus moved around the deck, offering tips to the men as they plied the waves with their fishing rods in search of fish. Dunstan caught a few fish while he waited, cutting their throats and tossing them into the box Janus had indicated was to hold their catch, until finally Janus came to him. "Have you caught anything yet?" Janus asked, examining Dunstan's tackle. Dunstan shrugged. "3 so far. I'm not really interested in fishing so much as going for a night sail. I don't have as much time to go out like I used to, what with my roster and all." He and Anemone had devised a cover story for him, which he dutifully memorized, even if he found it hard to believe. "This time when I came home, I found my woman had kicked me out. Shacked up with someone else. So I'm kind of at a loose end until I find someplace new to stay, or until my next rotation starts." Janus nodded. "FIFO, are you?" "Yeah, that's hard. I mean, working away all hours of the day and doing what's best for your family, only to have the bitch turn on you when you get home? I know what it's like. I used to do a bunch of week-long charters for mining guys just like you, and then one day, she up and left me. She swears there isn't another man, but there has to be, you know? She hasn't worked a day in her life since the first kid was born, and there's 3 of them. Someone's got to pay for their school fees and things. And that family court, bunch of criminals pretending to be lawyers if you ask me. They cleaned me out and almost took my boat. Gave it all to her, the money I earned, working my ass off while she was sitting on her ass all day watching cartoons with the kids." Janus shook his head. In what world were women suddenly reviled for taking care of their children? Dunstan desperately wanted to ask the man more, but he didn't dare. Anemone would explain it to him later, he hoped. "Now she expects me to babysit the kids on weekends, even got the court to write it into the divorce agreement, so she can cheat on me with the mystery guy she keeps saying she isn't sleeping with. I told her I can't have them in the evenings because I work nights, doing night fishing and all, but that didn't stop her. She drops them off in the morning and picks them up at night. I sleep through most of it except when the kids play too loud. Then I shout at them until they pipe down. I don't know what she was whining about, taking care of kids isn't hard. As if sitting around on her ass watching them and doing nothing isn't how her ass got so big." Janus tapped his nose. "You know what though? I fixed her. The court said I have to give her part of what I earned to support her and the kids, as if we were still married, but that's why I do so many night charters. You see, when you pay cash, I can keep it off the books, and if it's not on the books, then I don't owe her nothing." Dunstan felt sick, which was quite a feat for a gargoyle who wasn't sure he even had a stomach, let alone anything in it to throw up. This excuse for a man wanted to desert his wife and children instead of supporting them, like any honorable man would do. He wanted to punch the man, but for Anemone's sake, he couldn't. He forced himself to nod instead. "That's clever. My girl said she was pregnant, and we were going to get married, then when I got back, she's married to some other guy and telling him the baby's his." Janus just shook his head. "Bitch. If the other idiot believes that lying cheating whore without a DNA test, then he deserves her. You're better off without her, mate. Here, tell you what. Anytime you want to come back on a night fishing trip and you pay cash, I'll give you a 10% discount." The perfect opening for what he needed to ask. "What if I come every night, until I go back to site?" Then I don't need to find a place to stay yet. Janus frowned. Well, I do charters like this most nights, but occasionally I do a private one. Like a bachelor party. I couldn't take you out on those nights. What if you told them I was your deckhand? Dunstan asked eagerly. I'd still pay you the same. They'd never need to know. He could see the wheels turning in the man's brain. Extra money and a free pair of hands to help him? The greedy bastard couldn't possibly turn it down. All right, Janus said slowly. But you'll have to show me you know your way around a boat before that. So you can pass as a deckhand. Dunstan nodded eagerly, promising to be a fast learner who'd do everything that was asked of him. Well, until he didn't, of course, but Janus didn't need to know that. They returned to the harbour as the first streaks of dawn were colouring the sky. Dunstan raced home to give Anemone the good news. 40. Anemone couldn't sleep. Between the nightmares of Morgan's body or herself lost at sea, or waking up in a panic because she thought she'd heard a noise that was either Lucky or the house settling, if Dunstan had been home, she might have persuaded him to give her another glorious night of distraction, but he was off fishing for information with Janus. The sun wasn't even up when she finally gave in and decided to go into work early. It wasn't like she could sleep anyway. But as she stepped out of the front door, she noticed the cafe across the road was lit up, with the doors wide open and the most amazing smell wafting all the way over to her nose. Coffee and a muffin. She was inside before she'd even decided she wanted them. But when she saw the tray of muffins, she wanted them all. Good morning, the woman behind the counter said. Anemone couldn't seem to drag her eyes away from the muffins. One of all of them, please. And a coffee. Flat white today, a big one. She looked up to meet the woman's eyes and recognized her. Oh, Tacy, right? Tacy grinned. Yep. And I should probably ask for your name, not just so I can call you when your coffee's ready, but so I don't call you Muffin Addict in my head. When the muffins are as good as yours, addiction's inevitable, Anemone said. But my name is Anemone. Like the coral? That's what Morgan had said when they first met. A twinge of sadness plucked at her heart, but she pushed it away. Yeah, like the coral. Or the flowers. My mother thought they were really pretty, until she discovered the flowers are poisonous. The sea creature isn't any nicer though, it's venomous, related to jellyfish. That made her sound horrible. For the first time, Anemone wondered if her mother hadn't liked her much. Tacy only looked intrigued. So are you more like the flower, or the coral? Don't bite me or I'll kill you, or come closer so I can eat you. Anemone hesitated. Neither sounded like her. Well, I'm not really into biting. Tacy nodded. Coral then. You can look but you can't touch. Unless you had skin made of living stone, like Dunstan. Anemone sighed. She'd see him tonight, after the sun went down. Then he could tell her all about his fishing trip. Oh, and speaking of looking, we have an artist in residence in the evenings now. He's quite talented. You should come in and have your portrait drawn all while drinking your coffee. Or eating your muffin. Or both. Anemone laughed and said she'd think about it. Maybe one evening when Dunstan was out, and she had nothing better to do. Or she could bring Lucky and ask him to draw the cat for her. She should probably contact the shelter to say that Lucky had settled down into a proper house cat now, and she was ready for adoption. A lump welled up in her throat at the thought. She didn't want to lose Lucky. What if she contacted the shelter and said she wanted to adopt her, not just foster her? After all, she'd already named her, and Lucky was happily settled in her apartment. Better yet, she'd bonded with Dunstan and she'd seen him patting the cat on occasion, so the feeling was evidently mutual. Picking up her coffee and bag of muffins, Anemone thanked Tacy again and headed off to work. 41. He doesn't deserve to be a father, treating his children and their mother like that, Dunstan finished. Anemone regarded him thoughtfully, like she was still mulling over all the things he'd told her. And yet we're still giving him money, feeding his greed. It could just be a bachelor party, like he said, not a smuggling trip at all. People charter boats a lot, and a fishing trip with the boys is just such a normal thing to do, nobody would even think twice about it. I wasn't certain about it at first either, but the more he talked about it, I mean, it started out as just a private charter with no other guests allowed, and then he started saying things about how they go right offshore for this one, so there's a better chance of catching the best fish. He'd had a lot of beer by then, so maybe I didn't hear properly, but he said there's more profit out the back of Rottnest than there ever was at any of his inshore fishing spots. I don't know what it's like now, but in my day, smuggling paid far better than fishing, as long as you didn't get caught. If you did get caught, you'd be hanged. Anemone shuddered. Barbaric times. Thank goodness things have changed. Now smugglers just go to prison, like all the other criminals. Nothing so cruel as hanging or hard labor or, did you know there were regular floggings at the prison? One of the jewels of the museum's collection is the original Jarrah whipping post they used to tie the prisoners to before they beat them. Men, and sometimes even children. Times truly had changed if such things no longer happened. Dunstan remembered the bite of the lash, but he didn't dare tell her. Best she not know that his own sweat and blood had soaked into the whipping post she reviled. Well, I'll go along with this private charter, to see if I'm right or not. Best case scenario, I get to see the smugglers in action, and we can come up with a plan to rat them out. Anemone still didn't seem happy. All right. 42. After a week of anxiety about Dunstan going out on a boat trip that could be a drug delivery, Anemone was ready to kiss him when he came home. Except, the news wasn't good. After Janus had cruised past Rottnest, he'd met up with another boat. They transferred a number of boxes, just like the ones the police had found with Morgan's body, from the other boat to the catch of the day, before sailing back to Fremantle just before dawn. They needed a plan, and Dunstan's first idea, to sink both of these boats with everyone aboard, just like they'd done to Morgan, wasn't something Anemone could allow. Capital punishment isn't done these days. People pay for their crimes, they don't die for them. The police need to catch them, with enough evidence to convict them. You can't just kill them, Anemone tried to explain, but Dunstan was having none of it. I don't understand. How do you expect me to contact the police from way offshore and make sure the boats are still there when they arrive? He persisted. They're boats, they move. I mean, if it was a sailing boat, I could leave it dead in the water in a number of ways. If I broke the mast, they couldn't sail anywhere. If I snapped the rudder or broke off the wheel, they couldn't steer, but with these motorboats, not to mention life rafts and tenders, I wouldn't have the first idea how to stop them. I don't even know how the motor works. Anemone nodded. Wait, did you say taking the wheel off? That's what some of the yacht club members do when they sail to other marinas, to stop theft. Of course, all a thief would have to do is carry a spare wheel and they could steal whatever they wanted to, but if they were 30 kilometers or more offshore, a spare wheel would be much harder to find. Dunstan nodded. That he could do. But what about the police? How would they find them? Anemone considered. Usually, she'd say radio because every sailor she knew could manage the basics on a radio, but Dunstan was from a time before radio existed. Not to mention if anyone recorded his distress call, they'd have his voice print to compare to him later. For this to work, Dunstan had to be a ghost, someone who didn't exist. The easiest way to send a distress call from that far offshore was an EPIRB, but they had to be registered, which meant tying it back to her if not Dunstan. That would never do. Morgan had always kept a couple handy just in case, even though they rarely went far enough offshore to need one. In fact, she'd seen them on the Sea Witch, and made a mental note to have them checked and re-registered, seeing as they were coming up on the 2-year mark for that soon. But until she did, the beacons they had were both registered in Morgan's name. And what better ghost than an actual dead man? "I might know a way," she said slowly. "It's called an EPIRB. Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon. They activate when they get wet, or you can flip a switch to activate them manually. I'll get one from the Sea Witch and show you." By the time Anemone went to bed, she and Dunstan had a plan they both believed could work. Maybe. With a lot of luck and maybe a miracle. That didn't stop her from worrying about what might go wrong though. 43. Dunstan couldn't believe his luck. Everything had gone exactly as Anemone had planned. With the swell rougher than the week before, they'd lashed both boats together to pass the boxes over the gunwales, carrying them down into the hold, where Dunstan had been waiting to take each of the smugglers down one by one. Then he'd locked them in the hold. When the last box was aboard the catch of the day, he'd knocked Janus out and locked him in the privy, before heading over to the other vessel to do the same to their crew. 3 half-starved fishermen were no match for one gargoyle, and he soon had them lying on the floor of the hold, locked in with their stinking catch. That done, he'd hopped overboard to wind the anchor chains together, so even if they managed to escape and untie the ropes, they'd never manage to untangle the anchors, short of cutting them off entirely. Both wheels he tossed overboard as he headed back to Janus. Dunstan knew what Anemone had said about not wanting violence, but what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. Besides, she deserved answers about how her husband had died. So he tied Janus to the ladder that led up to the flybridge, then threw a bucket of seawater over him to rouse him. The man came up spluttering. What are you?" Dunstan grinned. Instead of human FIFO worker John Stan, he'd decided to confront the smuggler in all his gargoyle glory. Wings, horns and all. "Are you a demon? Am I in hell?" Dunstan just grinned wider. "I didn't do anything. I'm just the driver. I drive the boat and take the goods into shore. I have nothing to do with what happens to them after I land them." He tossed his head wildly. "Where's John? What did you do with John? He's a passenger, his name's on the books, I'll get in trouble if he doesn't make it back." "Like Morgan Seaver didn't make it back?" Janus shook his head. "I had nothing to do with that. I had gastro, okay? I couldn't skipper a boat when I couldn't even stand up. He was supposed to take them out and then come straight back. That was it. It's not my fault he tried to call the courier boat in when he saw it. They took him out before he could report what he thought was a foreign fishing vessel. He never even saw the cargo when it was transferred. But the passengers, none of them could drive the boat, and when they hit a reef on the way back, they had to take to the tender to escape before it sank. It wasn't until later they realized that they were missing Morgan. When the tender ran out of fuel halfway back to Fremantle, they jumped ship and sank that, and told the rescue crew a story about how they'd been fishing off Karnak Island, so they wouldn't find the boat or the body. Or the cargo. Only when they tried to go back to find it themselves, they couldn't. He continued in this vein for some time. When Dunstan was certain Janus didn't have any new information to add, he knocked the man out again and threw him in the hold with the other smugglers. One last thing to do and he could go home to Anemone. He dug out the beacon Anemone had given him, and stuck it to the front of the boat, just above the waterline. Then he ripped off the top and switched it on. A little red blinking light told him he'd activated it, just like Anemone had said. Mission accomplished. Dunstan flapped his wings and commenced his flight home. 44. When the sun rose, Dunstan hadn't returned. Anemone knew that didn't mean something bad had happened, but she couldn't seem to silence the thought that this was how she'd lost Morgan. While her coffee brewed, she picked up her phone to skim the morning news. There was a brief article saying that someone had set off an emergency beacon near Rottnest, and that marine rescue crews were investigating, before the article ended with the distinctly unsatisfying promise that there was more to come. At work, everyone seemed to be exchanging glances with each other and not looking at her. Anemone let it go on for an hour before she finally snapped. "What is it? What's the bad news everyone else has heard except me?" Luke, who looked like he'd had less sleep than Anemone last night, piped up, "It's probably nothing, but there was a boat in trouble on the morning news." "Oh, is that all?" "Yeah, I heard about that." Beth laid her hand on Anemone's arm, her eyes brimming with sympathy. "No one wanted to say anything in front of you because, well, your husband, and today of all days." Today. Anemone checked the date. A year ago to the day, she'd lost Morgan. And their baby. No wonder she was worried about Dunstan. She'd be worried about her worst enemy, if they were out on a boat today. She swallowed. "Every time I hear about a boat in trouble, my heart skips a beat. It probably always will. I just send a hope out into the universe that all will be well, that no one else will lose someone like I did, and then, well, I guess I find something else to occupy my attention. Speaking of which, does anyone have something that will distract me for the day? Bonus points if you can keep me away from my computer, so I'm not checking the news every 5 minutes." Luke came to her rescue. The cell with the last remaining original 1850s washbasin was due for conservation works. The basin itself wasn't the issue, but they'd found mold in the cell, which was a danger not just to the plumbing but the limestone cell walls and the Jarrah flooring, so if she could put on a protective suit and take a closer look, before putting together a brief to go to tender for conservation works. Any other day, Anemone would have laughed in his face for suggesting she do something so menial, but right now, inspecting the plumbing sounded perfect. By the time she headed home, she'd rediscovered her loathing for hazmat suits, sworn roundly at the vagueness of all the previous tender documentation, and cobbled together a draft of what sort of cleaning should happen to that cell, if the budget stretched to proper conservation work, and not just the sort of patch job that had been done every other time. But as she walked home, she sent out more than a hope to the universe. This time it was a siren call that the universe would return Dunstan to her, a year to the day since she lost her husband. Surely no one could be so unlucky twice in one lifetime. 45. Dunstan had never flown so far in his life. There was water below him, clearly visible as the sun threatened to crest over the horizon, and miles of ocean still separated him from Fremantle. He wouldn't be home this morning, and he couldn't fly any further, either. The moment the sun rose, he'd become a statue and fall right out of the sky into the waves below. Cursing, he folded his wings and dropped into the sea. Down he fell until he reached the seafloor where no light could touch him. Not a moment too soon, either, for he had to shake the stone stiffness from his limbs for several minutes before he could resume his journey home. One step after the other, along the seafloor. Good thing gargoyles didn't need to breathe. 46. The moment she entered her apartment, Anemone called his name. But only Lucky answered the call, chirping for her dinner. She fed the cat, but there was no sign of Dunstan. The sunset blazed through the eastern windows, a blur of orange she could barely see through her tears. She couldn't lose Dunstan. She wouldn't. She'd go down to the harbor and wait for him as soon as it was dark. But what if he came here instead, while she was down there? But. She raced up to the roof, peering out in all directions in the hope that she'd see him coming. Walking along the road. Flying through the sky. Something. But he wasn't there. She would go to the harbor, she decided. Down the stairs, out the front door to the landing, then down the staircase to the foyer. Anemone? Dunstan? She flew into his arms, kissing him for all she was worth. She wrapped her arms and legs around him, not caring that her skirt rode up to her waist. All she cared about was that he was here, safe with her, and he was. "Why are you naked?" He chuckled. "Clothes weighed me down in the water. Then I had to wait until dark to fly back, so no one would see me. But I'm here now." "Yes, oh yes." He was so hot and hard between her legs. Why was she still wearing underwear? She needed to feel him inside her. "No." "Dunstan, please," she moaned. He slid 2 fingers between her skin and those stupid knickers and tore them away. Now there was nothing between them. "Fuck me. Please." He slammed her back against the wall, entering her with a fierceness that matched her own need for him. "Yes, yes, oh yes." Hard and fast, like nothing she'd ever known before. Better than any time before. She could barely believe it, but she was about to come already. She buried her face in his shoulder, certain she was going to scream. "Did you just bite me?" He laughed. "I don't think a woman's ever bitten me before. I might need to bite you back for that. But where?" His hands made quick work of her shirt buttons and her bra, baring her breasts. She arched her back, begging him to do whatever he wished to her. "Anemone. Anemone." That wasn't his voice. It sounded like Katina, in a panic, as she pounded on Anemone's front door on the landing above. Anemone blinked. She and Dunstan were in the foyer, backed into the little alcove beneath the stairs. His wings held her up while he was still buried balls deep inside her as his hands cupped her breasts, his mouth inches away from ravaging her in the most delightful way possible. "She's not home." That was a male voice, also upstairs. "What did you intend to tell her, anyway?" "That there's a thing in her dungeon, a winged horned demon who means to seduce her so he can have his wicked way with her? She'll never believe you." "I have to try." "Anemone." Katina pounded on the door again. Anemone's eyes met Dunstan's. He gave her a lazy grin, curling his tail around her nipple and giving it a squeeze. She gasped, then clapped her hand over her mouth, hoping they hadn't heard. He began to move inside her again, exquisitely slow and oh so deep. She forgot all about the neighbors and dungeons and demons, horned or otherwise, and lost herself to sensation as Dunstan took first one nipple into his mouth, then the other. She was close, so close when he stilled and said, "I think they've gone. It's safe to go upstairs." She didn't want to stop. She wanted him to finish what he was doing to her, or she was definitely going to bite him this time. "Unless you want to send your big winged horned demon thing back to the dungeon. I'd prefer to take you up to your bed, where I can have my wicked way with you, over and over again." His eyes dared her to protest. "Upstairs." "Now," she managed to say. His wings wrapped around her, and she only had a moment to take a breath before she was whirled through walls to her bedroom. He was still inside her. And she was so close. "Sit on the bed," she commanded. He did, settling her in his lap. Anemone rose up onto her knees, then sank down on him again. She grasped his horns in her hands. "We're doing things my wicked way first," she said. 47. Several hours and countless orgasms later, Anemone lay beside Dunstan on the bed, breathless and aching, but happier than she could remember since a year ago. "Why would my neighbor try to warn me about you?" she asked. "How would she even know about you?" Dunstan shrugged. "Perhaps she saw me on my way back from the harbor. I succeeded, by the way. The plan went exactly the way it was supposed to. I could see the beacon blinking as I flew away." Anemone felt her cheeks grow hot. She'd been so worried about Dunstan, then so happy to see him back safe, that she hadn't cared about her husband's killers anymore. All she'd wanted to do was make love with her monster. Up against the wall on the bed, bent over the blanket box, then back on the bed. She was fast becoming addicted to his cock, if she wasn't already. And his mouth and his wings and his hands and that troublesome tail, if she didn't know better, she'd think she was in love with him. And the thought of losing him. Who was she kidding? She was in love with him. She traced a line down his rock-hard abdominal muscles, stopping just short of his ever-hard cock. One of the perks of being made of living stone, he'd said. We should make love to celebrate your victory, she said. Or I could finally have my wicked way with you, like your neighbors warned you about. He sat up, then patted his thigh. Come sit in my lap, sweet lass. She'd barely sat down when his wings curled around her, holding her in place. Hold on to my horns, he whispered. So I can take you on the ride of your life. Which he did. 48. It was a week before the police arrived at her door again. A week of busy days at work, and heavenly nights in bed with Dunstan. Not even on her honeymoon had she had this much sex, but the moment the sun went down and he appeared, she was desperate for more. But in the afternoon light, with detectives Nunzio and Rasool on her doorstep, she shoved away any thoughts of sex and tried to look like Morgan's grieving widow, for surely it was his murder they were here to discuss. She let them sit in her kitchen again, but she didn't make coffee this time. She'd already had enough for any normal Saturday, and she intended to buy her next one from the shut-up cafe across the road before they closed for the day. The coroner is finished with your husband's remains and is ready to release them to you so you can lay them to rest, Detective Rasool began. Anemone nodded. They'd already had a funeral service for Morgan, even though there'd been no body in the casket. Now there was a body, she'd have to arrange for him to be cremated. He'd always said he wanted his ashes scattered at sea, and she would give him that. Thank you. Dr. Seaver, what do you know about Janus Smith? She blinked. He owned the boat my husband was aboard when he died. The Perfect Catch. Yes, but what did you know about him? She blew out a breath. I knew him as my friend Lucy's husband. A member of the yacht club, with a beaten-up charter boat he didn't take proper care of. He was friends with Morgan, everyone was friends with Morgan, that's just how he was, but I didn't like him. He was sleazy, especially when Lucy wasn't around. After they got divorced, I avoided him altogether. The two men nodded. Nunzio still took notes, but Rasool had set his tablet down, eager to ask the next question. Do you know why Mr. Smith would have one of your husband's emergency beacons on his boat? Anemone shrugged. Well, Morgan did take the Perfect Catch out that fateful night. He never went out without an EPIRB, so I'm sure he had one with him. Which is weird, come to think of it, because why didn't it go off when the boat sank? I thought they activated when they got wet. Or was the boat too deep for the beacon to get picked up by satellite, before the signal died? The two men exchanged glances. Whatever it was, neither of them wanted to be the one to tell her. A beacon registered to your husband activated a week ago, about 40 kilometers offshore. We found it attached to Mr. Smith's new boat, the Catch of the Day, which was tangled up with another boat, a foreign fishing vessel with a very interesting cargo. Dunstan hadn't mentioned any cargo or anything about the other boat, so Anemone didn't have to feign her surprise. What was it? Well, drugs, but also a large quantity of trepang. Several species of sea cucumber found only in protected marine parks along the West Australian coast. Her breath hissed out. Illegal fishing and drug smuggling? I hope those men go to jail for a long time. That's horrible. Is there anything else you can tell us about Janus Smith? Anemone shook her head. Nothing I haven't already told you. I barely knew the man. What about his new deckhand, John Stan? Who? She tried to make her face as blank as possible. Mr. Smith has a new deckhand, a man he was training to help him in his charter business, by the name of John Stan. They hadn't signed any new contracts yet, so all we have is his word that this man exists and the testimony of one of the passengers, a rather cooperative man who deeply regrets punching your husband. Morgan's killer. Anemone swallowed. You're saying this man, John Stan, is responsible for my husband's death? No, he's just a person of interest. One of Mr. Smith's passengers last week, when the beacon was activated, confessed to being on board the Perfect Catch the night your husband died. And both he and Mr. Smith have the most remarkable story about a deckhand who disappeared and a demon who attacked their boat. Mr. Smith said the demon tied him up and did things to him. A demon. Well, Dunstan was a bit of a sex fiend, but she was no worse than him, and she was definitely human. Are you sure they didn't see the Mothman? There have been some videos on the internet, or aliens. I've heard aliens are into kinky things like that. Nunzio shook his head. I don't know what they saw. Maybe they were all drunk, or they made it up. We will get the real story in time, and I strongly encourage you to tell us all you know now, or we'll have to return to ask more questions. Anemone shrugged again. No one wants to get to the bottom of my husband's death more than I do detectives. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But if you're looking for imaginary monsters, you won't find them here. I'm a scientist. I believe in what I can observe, not some hoax someone made up. If you had a picture of this deckhand or the demon. Rasul offered her a smile. Much like the legal system, Dr. Seaver. We believe in evidence and what it can prove. Unreliable testimony about demons and men who don't seem to exist, well, it does seem far-fetched. Of course no one thought to take a picture, even though the men all had their phones with them. Perhaps they intend to plead insanity for their crimes in court. I don't know much about court cases, criminal or otherwise. But I do wish you luck with your investigation, Anemone said. Did your informant have anything useful for you that does help? Aside from his wild stories about demons and deckhands, he'd told them everything he knew about the drug trade as he knew it, including the people who daubed threatening messages on that nurse's wall, so it sounded like there were a lot more arrests to come. Anemone and the nurse would be safe. It took another minute or two of small talk before she could close the door firmly behind them. Anemone checked her watch. She still had time to get coffee and a muffin. 49. Anemone stared at the muffin cabinet, not quite able to come to terms with the emptiness. She decided in the short walk across the road that she deserved an extra muffin after that interrogation, and now she couldn't even have one. Rochelle offered a sympathetic smile. I'm sorry, we're out of muffins today. But we do have some new white chocolate and raspberry mousse cheesecakes. Individual ones. Layers of white chocolate mousse over raspberry mousse, on a dark chocolate biscuit base. She pointed at the cabinet. It goes really well with a Vienna dark hot chocolate. Anemone closed her eyes. A sensible person would go home and have a salad. But she didn't want to be sensible. Besides, who ate salads in winter? She'd happily heat up some vegetable soup, but lettuce could wait until the weather was warmer. Yes please, she said. Rochelle rang up the sale, and Anemone tapped her card to pay for it. You could go sit in the corner. Our artist in residence is due in soon and he's very popular. If you're first in line, he might even get your portrait finished in time for you. Take it with you when you go. Rochelle shooed her toward the corner table. Go on, I'll bring your order out to you when it's ready. Reluctantly, Anemone headed for the corner, then changed her mind and took the table next to it. The wall was covered with sketches, both black and white and color. Mostly people's faces, head and shoulders portraits, some of them drinking coffee or eating cake. There was a whole row of Rochelle in various poses as she served people at the counter. The artist had captured her smile perfectly, even in the sketches that looked like a few hurried lines. Maybe she should wait for the artist and ask him to draw her portrait. An artist's first impression of who she was now, Morgan's widow, Dunstan's lover, or just the cafe's muffin addict? Maybe a cheesecake addict if it looked as good as it tasted, she thought as Rochelle approached. Anemone took her time savoring the cheesecake, which was every bit as good as Rochelle had promised. The Vienna chocolate was too bitter until she dumped a couple of packets of sugar into it and stirred the cream through, which made it drinkable, if not something she'd order again. But by the time she'd finished, the sun was almost down and Dunstan would be waking up. She cast one last, longing glance at the pictures on the wall, but the mysterious artist who'd drawn them hadn't arrived, and she wanted to tell Dunstan about the police visit, before they got too distracted doing other things. Perhaps she'd get her portrait done tomorrow, or some other night. Dunstan was waiting. 50. Have a delightful day, my sweet lass. I'll be back to warm your bed at sundown, Dunstan whispered in her ear. He kissed her neck one last time and then he was gone, back into the darkness to hide from the dawn. Anemone eyed the blinds. They were supposed to block out the sun, but two telltale stripes on either side let in the light that drove Dunstan away every morning. Now, if she were to get block-out curtains that went over the window and covered the sides, maybe she'd be able to wake up beside him, and even make love in the mornings before she went to work. Or all morning on a Sunday like this one. Well, now she was awake, she might as well get up and use the bathroom. Anemone made it as far as the sink before nausea overcame her and she spewed up. Wow, that had to be last night's dinner, and that lovely cheesecake too. There must have been something wrong with the cheesecake, she decided. Or that bitter chocolate. She rinsed out her mouth and headed to the kitchen for some water before she went back to bed. The water didn't want to stay down either. An hour later, when all she brought up was Billa, Anemone lay on the bed, with all the energy of a limp dish rag. It had to have been something from the cafe. She hadn't been this sick since before Morgan died. When she was still pregnant. No, she couldn't be. Anemone fumbled for her phone, to check the calendar. She hadn't really paid much attention to her period, with Morgan gone. It wasn't like she could try for another baby, with no husband anymore. Her last period had been 6 weeks ago. That wasn't possible. Dunstan was a gargoyle, for God's sake. Stone. He didn't get hard-ons like a normal human because he didn't have blood, or any of the other bodily fluids necessary to get a girl pregnant. Unless he could. 6 weeks pregnant. Even that wasn't possible. She'd have had to conceive the day before her last period was due, and she and Dunstan hadn't been bonking like rabbits for more than a week. Well, except that first night after she'd found Morgan. But that had been one time, and he hadn't actually come, had he? She didn't know. She'd been so caught up in her own pleasure, she hadn't even paid attention to his. Oh, he evidently enjoyed what they did, that she was certain of, but if he'd ever, she couldn't say. It's not like he shouted her name the way she screamed his. And he wasn't human, so he didn't go all soft for a bit afterward, like normal men. But even if he did, getting pregnant on the first time? Without even trying? After she and Morgan had tried for years and she'd still lost the baby. She couldn't be pregnant. Not possible. She still had some pregnancy tests in the bathroom cabinet. As soon as she had enough fluid in her to pee on one, she'd prove once and for all that she was not pregnant with her gargoyle lover's baby. 51. The afternoon sun streamed through the bathroom window, haloing the 3 pregnancy tests Anemone had lined up on the sink. All 3 said the same thing, that there was nothing wrong with the cafe's cheesecake, and in a little under 8 months, if she was very, very lucky, she'd finally become a mother. She swept the tests into the bin. She shouldn't get her hopes up. She'd lost the last one, and there was no guarantee she'd be able to carry this baby to term. Maybe she wasn't meant to be a mother. Some people weren't, after all. She had lucky. That would do her. But if she could carry this child to term. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd do her utmost to be the best mother possible. She wouldn't be perfect, but she'd at least try. It wasn't like she'd be able to have more than one. Just one child would be a miracle. More than she dared to hope for. Anemone burst into tears. She wasn't sure how long it took her to get control of herself and wipe her eyes and nose, but by the time she did, she had a plan. She'd visit her doctor during the week for a checkup, to make sure everything was all right, and set up an appointment with the obstetrician she'd chosen last time. But first, she should find the box of baby things she'd bought for the baby she lost. A box she'd brought to the apartment, but hadn't been able to bear to unpack. Until now. Anemone checked every room in the house, but there was no sign of that box. Could she have stashed it in the storeroom downstairs? She couldn't think where else it could be. She flicked on the light in the storeroom and saw why. Beside the box was another one she'd ordered online, which had arrived after she'd lost the baby. It had a picture of a bassinet on the side, with a joyful mother and baby. She'd barely been able to look at it. Now, she regarded it thoughtfully. She'd done a lot of research, and it had been the best bassinet available then, which meant it would definitely do for this baby. She'd better bring it upstairs now while she could still lift things just in case. She made it across the foyer and halfway up to the landing before she regretted picking up the box. She should have waited and asked Dunstan to carry the damn thing. "Oh, do you need help with that?" Katina and a hulking man she didn't know stood on the landing, staring down at her. The strong, independent woman in her wanted to say no. But the one who'd thrown up half a dozen times before breakfast won. "Oh yes, please." The Hulk picked it up in one hand like it weighed nothing, then waited at the top of the stairs, frowning at it, while Anemone dragged herself up afterward. "Are you having a baby?" Katina exclaimed. "You're barely showing at all. Wow, you must have conceived the last time you and your husband, that's—" She turned an alarming shade of red and shut up. "Where do you want me to put this?" the Hulk asked. Anemone pushed open the door and pointed down the hall. "Just put it in the guest room, please." He dropped it off, then returned to stand beside Katina. "We wish you all the best for your health and happiness," he said, his deep frown belying his words, before he wrapped an arm around Katina's shoulders and all but dragged her back into her apartment. "Tor, that was rude." Katina scolded, then turned to call over her shoulder, "Sorry about Tor. He's not used to things like good manners and talking to women. We're really very happy for you." The door slammed shut behind her. Anemone stared after them for a long moment, before heading back into her own apartment. Her neighbor's weird new boyfriend, if that's indeed what he was, definitely wasn't her problem. She had enough to worry about. And maybe even wish for. 52. Sex with Anemone was like nothing else Dunstan had ever experienced. As a man he'd had good sex, or at least he thought he had, but with her, he could go all night with wave after wave of pleasure washing over both of them. He hadn't thought it would be possible for a gargoyle to experience an orgasm, but with Anemone, it wasn't a question of if, but how many. More than he cared to count now because he was too intent on her pleasure, the way her breath caught just before she clenched down hard and screamed his name. He could go all night, but she was still human, so she needed sleep. Reluctantly he pulled out of her and cleaned them both up. The shimmer in her eyes as she stared up at him, if he didn't know better, he'd think it was love. But he'd never known a woman who was capable of love, no matter how many times she said she was. Anemone had never spoken of love, and he'd never known her to lie, which made her superior to most of the women he'd met. Yet when he heard someone shouting his name from the rooftop, he knew he had to answer. But he waited until Anemone had drifted off to sleep, before he left her side to find out who was making so much noise. A hulking man stood on the other side of the fence that separated Anemone's section of the rooftop from her neighbor's. A familiar shape, though Dunstan couldn't summon a single memory that would tell him the man's name. "How do you know me?" Dunstan demanded. He might not remember, but the other man might. "You are my brother." Then? So much hope in that one syllable, only for it to be dashed when the other man shook his head. "Torsten." He knew the name, but memories of the man were slow to surface. Perhaps if he could see the man's face. "Step into the light, so I can see you, brother." If indeed this man was his brother. Torsten leaped lightly over the low fence, so the beam of the streetlight struck his face. Yes, it was familiar, but... "You're still cursed," Torsten said. "A gargoyle still. I thought you must be a man to have fathered a child, but, how?" A child. He remembered talk of a child, though he had never seen the boy. "Kara. She gave my son to Oscar when she married him." Memories surfaced, of Kara's face, as she told him she'd chosen his best friend instead of him to be her husband, even when the child was Dunstan's. She'd spoken of love, but it had been a lie. "That's a lie. You never let me say a bad word about Kara, even as you pined for her loss, but she was a lying whore who double-crossed you and Oscar both. The boy she gave birth to was Oscar's son. I'd swear it on our father's grave. She met him in the quarry every day for months, moaning like a mad ghost as she fucked him. It was only a matter of time before she got pregnant, and she married him, like she wanted. Then you came home, and she threw Oscar's proposal in his face after you seduced her. Then she came to tell you about the babe, swearing it was yours, screaming about how you'd promised to marry her, but you'd already gone back to sea. I had to call her a liar, to send her to beg Oscar to take her back. The poor man married her, harpy that she was, and you dodged a bullet with that one. So don't talk to me about Kara." Dunstan didn't understand. "Then what child are you talking about?" "The one the widow carries in her belly. Your child, for it cannot belong to her dead husband. We came to warn her about you, but we were already too late, weren't we? You'd seduced her, just like you seduced Kara. God damn you, Dunstan, she was still a widow in mourning. That first night he'd made love to Anemone, and every amazing night since. These memories were crystal clear. Every breathy moan, every desperate plea for more. If he'd seduced Anemone, she'd seduced him right back. It wasn't like that. Me and Anemone, we fell in love. He wanted to deny that it was possible, but the moment he'd thought the words, they felt right. That didn't mean he'd blurt them out to this man. The man who claimed to be his brother, blaming him for... Did you say Anemone is pregnant? Of course, you fool. What do you think happens when you bed a woman? How do you know? How could this stranger possibly know when Dunstan himself didn't? Because Katina and I saw her today, carrying a cradle upstairs for the baby. And where were you? Dunstan closed his eyes. In the dark, hiding from the sun, when he should have been helping her. She's not Kara. This is a good woman, and you can still make an honest woman of her. You go back down there now and marry her, like you should, instead of running away to sea. Be a father to your own child, though God only knows what a half-gargoyle baby will look like. Marry her before she has the sense to find someone else, like Kara did, to be a real father, to provide for her and the child. Torsten shook his head. You were supposed to protect her, not seduce her. No wonder you haven't broken the curse, if you couldn't even protect her from yourself. Of course he'd protected her. From the ceiling collapsing and then helping catch her husband's killers. He'd held her when she cried, been there for her whenever she needed him. Even in bed, it had been her need that had called him to her, and he couldn't deny her. Couldn't deny her anything. If Anemone was really carrying his child. He looked up, but Torsten had gone. Some brother, judging him, then disappearing before he could defend himself. To hell with him. This was between him and Anemone. He would return to her and wait until she woke. Then he'd ask her, and if what Torsten told him was true, then she would make him the happiest man alive. 53. When Anemone opened her eyes, she found Dunstan staring at her. "Good morning," she said, then sat up so she could see the clock. 5 am. Oh no, that was far too early to be awake. I take that back. I need more sleep. Please? She opened her eyes again. He was still staring at her. What? Is it true? Are you carrying my child? She sighed. She'd wanted to wait until she'd seen the doctor to make sure everything was okay, but I think so. I took a pregnancy test and it came back positive, but seeing as I lost the last one, I wasn't certain. I've made a doctor's appointment on Monday, so she can check if everything's all right. I wasn't going to say anything until she confirmed it, but how on earth did you find out? Is it some sort of secret gargoyle power you haven't told me about? Torsten told me. My neighbor's grumpy new boyfriend? If she hadn't liked him before, she was seriously pissed at him now. He's an asshole. He's my brother. She blinked. Poor you. Dunstan laughed. He ordered me to marry you. A huge, nosy, interfering asshole whose ass I am totally going to kick when I see him next. What business is it of his? It doesn't matter. He's right. If you're going to be the mother of my child, then I want to marry you. To provide for you and the baby. Not just protect you. I'll need to find a job and learn how to live in this time. Do I get a say in this? Dunstan stared at her. But I thought you'd be happy. Isn't that what every woman wants, a man who will take care of her while she has their children? I don't know, I've never had children. I might be a terrible mother. I might not even be able to carry a child to term. I mean, I know I wanted children. I wanted a family. I just gave up when Morgan died. Now I've only had a few hours to get used to the idea that it might be possible again, and you're talking about marriage? It's 5 am. Anemone closed her eyes. She was babbling, and even she didn't know what she wanted. Well, Dunstan, obviously. And the baby, if fate would allow her to keep it. Ask me again when the baby is born. When we know he or she is safe and healthy and ours. And we'll be able to walk down the aisle in front of us at the wedding. Now she had the image in her head of a chubby toddler in a white dress, clutching a bunch of flowers. Or would it be a little ring bearer in an adorable suit? You don't want to marry me? His voice sounded even, but she could see the hurt in his eyes. Anemone sighed. This is crazy. I've only known you a few weeks, but I already can't imagine my life without you. I'm pretty sure I'm in love with you. So fuck yeah, I want to marry you. But not before this baby can walk. This isn't Victorian times. We can have a baby together without being married, and work things out as we go along. Oh, except the sex. Pretty sure we've got that figured out, and I want a lot more of that. Right up to the 3rd trimester, if I remember correctly. And afterwards, obviously. Dunstan was still staring at her. I don't think I've ever met a woman quite like you, Anemone Seaver. Well, if I marry you, I might not be Anemone Seaver for much longer. What is your last name anyway? I don't think you've ever told me. He paused, then said, Stone. Dunstan stone. Figures. A gargoyle called Stone. I could live with that. She took a deep breath. Dunstan Stone, father of the child I'm carrying, will you marry me when this baby learns to walk? If that is what you wish, then yes. Of course I will. She smiled. Actually, right now, what I wish is that we could make love again before the sun comes up. Dawn isn't until 7, so maybe. Dunstan flipped her onto her back, then loomed over her before leaning in for a kiss. For my betrothed, I shall see that you have 3 orgasms before the sun rises. And he proceeded to give her all that, and more. 54. Do we have to invite them over for dinner? Dunstan complained. Yes. I promised Katina I'd make her dinner ages ago for helping me out, and he's your brother. We should probably announce our engagement, so he'll stop glowering all the time. Or maybe that's just his normal expression, and your brother is a grumpy git. Someone knocked at the door. Right, that'll be them. Do you want to answer it? Dunstan headed off, then returned a minute later with Katina and Torsten, whatever his name was, in tow. Anemone, this is my younger brother, Torsten. This is my betrothed, Anemone. She wishes to kick your ass for gossiping about her baby, but, given her condition, I intend to do it for her. Dunstan advanced on his brother. Stop. Katina stood between them, one hand resting on each man's chest. What have I told you about fighting? To Anemone's surprise, Tor hung his head. Not even outside? No. There was some grumbling, but Tor took a seat at the table, and the others joined him. Anemone checked the oven timer. She had 20 minutes time to sit down and have a glass of, well, not wine for her, but something anyway. So are you a gargoyle too? She asked Tor. Not anymore. Katina broke the curse. Anemone stared. It's a curse? How do you break it? Katina turned red. The spellbook said something about melting a heart of stone. Tor's curse broke the morning after we had sex for the first time. She coughed. Obviously, that wasn't the case with you two, if he's still a gargoyle. So, I guess you'll need to try something different. Her cheeks grew even redder. Like whipped cream and sprinkles, Tor suggested. Katina looked like she wanted to dive under the table and hide. Anemone hid her smile. Best if she changed the subject before the poor girl died of embarrassment. So, do you have any more gargoyle brothers I should know about? Tor and Dunstan exchanged a glance. Have you seen Ben? Dunstan asked. Tor shook his head. He was there with us that night. First he took you away, then me, but I don't know what happened to Ben. If he was buried beneath this house, like we were, surely he should have been awoken when we were, but... They turned to the girls. Is there any way to find out what happened? Katina shrugged. Well, if he was a convict like you two, there might be something in the prison records. That's Anemone's department, not mine though. Anemone froze. Dunstan hadn't told her he was a convict. He'd hardly told her anything about his past. No wonder if the father of her child was a criminal. Let me get my computer, she heard herself say, and hurried out of the room. In the study, she took a moment to breathe through the panic and compose herself before she returned to the table with her laptop. She logged into the database, then asked, "What's your brother's name?" Ben Stone, Tor said. Anemone typed it in, then hit enter. She stared at the record for a long moment. There wasn't much, but it was enough. It says here he died in 1855. That's not possible. He was right there with us. He had to be turned into a gargoyle too. He was going to study art. He was so good. Paint, pencil, stone, he could draw to life and make you believe a statue was ready to step off the plinth. It looked so real. I remember the statue of a girl he carved for Burke Castle. She looked like she was about to open her eyes any moment. Ben can't be dead. He just can't be. Check it again. Dunstan's eyes begged her, and Anemone clicked on the record to see if there was any more. There was the date of his arrival and the date of his death. And his crime, murder. I'm sorry, Anemone said. There's nothing else here. It says he died in June 1855. While the brothers expressed their disbelief and grief all over again, Anemone clicked on the search box. This time she just typed stone and hit enter. 3 names came up. Only one had a death date, but all 3 had the same arrival date, and they'd been convicted of the same crime. Anemone closed her eyes. She'd slept with a convicted killer. How could she have been so stupid? All the signs had been there. The number of times he'd offered to inflict violence on people for her, to avenge Morgan's killer, what he'd done to that catamaran. Yeah, your brother's dead, and I'm sorry, but you both have some explaining to do. She turned the screen around so they could all see it. Care to explain how you were convicted of murder and weren't hanged for it? Tor and Dunstan exchanged glances. We didn't do it. Wrongfully accused, wrongfully convicted, we never even touched her. We weren't even home, but they found her body in our cottage, so. Katina's hand touched Anemone's wrist. If he's still cursed and your protector, you can command him to tell you the truth. He won't be able to lie. Anemone closed her eyes. She didn't want to believe he was a murderer, but she didn't want to give him orders either. It was all kinds of wrong. But she couldn't marry a murderer. Dunstan, she begged, wishing he could fix this. The truth? He hung his head. She's right. Command me to tell the truth, and I must. I already have, but if you need to hear it again. I love you, and I would never hurt you. I've never hurt a woman in my life, and I never will. I might have punched a man or 2, but I've never killed one. She stared into his eyes for a long moment. She wanted to believe him so much. What about Tor? He never killed anyone either. And Ben? Dunstan sighed. He was in love with her. He wanted to marry her, to take her as his wife to the Swan River colony. We would have helped him, but she died. Nobody knows who did it. Tor's frown deepened. I warrant Ben knows, or he did. Dunstan's hand landed on Anemone's. She didn't move away. Please, Anemone. We need to find out what happened to Ben. If he really died that day or whatever you can discover. Are there other records that you can't access with that thing? He waved at the laptop. She blew out a breath. Yes, there are records at the prison that haven't yet been digitized. I can go through them and see what I can find about your brother. Even if it's just where he's buried, so we can pay our respects, Tor said. Anemone couldn't deny them that. All right. Tomorrow I'll see what I can find for you. But if the database says he's dead, don't get your hopes up. Even with modern medicine, people rarely live past 100. The brothers exchanged a look of deep sadness. He was the best of us. You should have seen his artwork. Maybe some of that survived, even if he didn't. You never know. You never know. 55. Good evening. 1 cinnamon roll and a double-shot espresso for my protector as promised, Rochelle announced as she set her tray down on the table. What are you working on? Today's masterpiece, he said, holding up the sketch. I do not stick my tongue out like that. Sure you do. Whenever you're doing a design in the froth on top of a cappuccino, you stick the tip of your tongue out, just like that. I'm going to add it to the collection. He pinned it to the wall, next to all the other sketches he'd done of her. Rochelle shook her head. If you and Tacy hadn't sworn you were here to be my protector at night, I'd wonder if you're a stalker. I mean, that many pictures of me is a bit much. He shrugged. When the cafe is quiet and it's just you and me here, I take my inspiration from you. I believe I shall call today's piece Blep. He scrawled the letters beneath the picture and underlined them. Rochelle had to laugh. You're a nutter all right, but they do say great art requires at least a little bit of crazy. Ooh, look, we have a customer. For you or for me? He pulled out his portfolio. For me, I think. I have a commission for him. Rochelle returned to the counter. Is that mine? The man asked eagerly. Oh, it's beautiful. You've got the fish scales just right. It's better than the photo. The artist smiled indulgently. Why, thank you. The man pulled out his wallet and paid him, but he didn't put it away. Actually, I wanted to ask if you could do some pictures of my kids in the same style, so I could frame them. My wife and me are divorced, and I only get to see them on weekends. I could show you some pictures. He pulled out his phone and started swiping. The artist held up his hand. I'd be happy to do portraits of your children, but I must see them first. Pictures are all good and well, but they don't have the same life as the presence of a real person. Bring your kids into the cafe one evening when I'm working, and I'll do it. The man put his wallet and phone away. Oh, I will. This is beautiful. I'll tell all my mates at work about you too. He squinted at the artist's signature. What did you say your name is again? Ben? Ben Stone. Evening artist in residence at the Shut Up Cafe, the artist said. This has been Broken Bonds. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 2 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.